forced entry. It just didn't appear there was any struggle inside the house. We don't have a weapon in the house at this time.
This case is legendary in the Houston Police Department because of the complicated web of suspects and because of the bureaucratic interference. It took dedicated investigative work to solve.
That's the picture that haunted me.
Just a reminder every day while I was working on that case.
Because of this case, Johnny gained the moniker the cop who wouldn't quit, rightfully so.
Just every time I turned around, I was told, you can't do this, quit kicking a dead horse. But I knew that it's going to come together.
As I walked in, my mind was completely blank. I was just there to do a job.
Even though this case was a victory for Johnny Bonds, this case broke him, and it's still hard for him to talk about it to this day.
I won't let anything stop me. It's about justice and it's about truth.
On the morning of July the 6th, 1979, a housekeeper that worked at the Wanstroth home went to work, knocked on the front door trying to get in. Nobody answered, so she went to the window and peered in and saw John and Diana slumped over in their living room. And when help arrived, they went inside the house and found that John and Diana had been shot in the head. They called the Houston Police Department, and Sergeant Johnny Bonds responds to the scene.
We walked in, and I immediately see Diana Wanstroth laying on the floor in front of the fireplace. John Wanstroth is sitting about 10 feet away from her. They had not started decomposing. Wasn't any older, so we knew they'd been dead about 12 hours when they were discovered. Then I went into the nursery. Whew, I can't believe I still get so emotional. There's a crib there, and a 14-month-old baby's laying face down on a mattress, surrounded by stuffed animals in a pool of blood, and been shot in the back of the head. Except for the blood, you'd think this was just a baby sleeping. It's hard. Still hard. It's one of those things that I wished I couldn't see. Didn't appear the house had been burglarized or forced entry. I was thinking that probably the husband killed his wife and baby and then killed himself. He was a big man, and he filled up the chair. I thought, well, the gun's going to be beside him in the chair, or it's going to be on the floor under the chair. When we moved the body, there's no gun there. We searched the house thoroughly. Not only was there no gun, there was nothing to indicate they ever owned a gun. So there wasn't any doubt in my mind that this was not suicide, that it was a murder.
John Wanstroth is a scientist. He's an oceanographer. He developed a computer model to predict the storm surges of hurricanes. It was revolutionary at the time. Diana Wanstroth was almost the exact opposite of John Wanstroth. She was exuberant, she was a socialite, and the trappings of being a socialite mattered to her, where John, he couldn't care less.
Everybody was talking about what wonderful people they were. No marital problems, very happy. I learned all this while I'm out talking to friends and neighbors. All the neighbors adored him.
John, he was just a delightful, intelligent person, and Diana loved him very much. They had wanted a child, and when Diana realized that she couldn't have a child of her own, she accepted it, and she moved forward and adopted Kevin. It was wonderful. I mean, we were thrilled for her. She was very doting. They'd recently moved back to Houston. They were planning their 10th wedding anniversary. She had social connections. They didn't have any enemies.
You know, the first thing I look for is motive at that point. Who would want to kill them and why kill the whole family? And then one of the first thoughts that I had would be money and inheritance. So I started looking at who would benefit from the family's death, and of course it was other family members.
John and Diana's estate is worth about $1 million, and that's in 1979. Today, that would be over $4 million.
We've seen people killed for a whole lot less. The harder thing here to appreciate happening is that you would also want to kill your own blood and to kill a baby.
The day of the funeral, Johnny went to John Wanstrath's family and told them he wanted to polygraph everyone. They were a little shaken up.
Now, I did this intentionally for them to be together. I said, you all are going to get money out of these deaths. So I said, unfortunately, you're suspects until I can prove otherwise. They didn't protest. They all agreed to do so. So they came into homicide, and John Wanstrath's family passed the polygraph.
After Johnny was able to clear out by polygraphing all of John Wanstrath's family, he brought in Diana's only surviving family member.
Diana Wanstrath had a brother that lived in Houston named Markham Duff Smith. Markham comes in with Cindy, his wife. This guy looks like he just walked out of a GQ magazine. He's got on a suit, a tie, perfect hair.
Markham Duff Smith says he was home all night with his wife, Cindy, and she confirms that.
And I said, I still like for you to take polygraphs so I can eliminate you and work on whoever actually did this. But now Markham's almost indignant. You know, how long is this going to take? My lawyer told me I shouldn't take this test. You know, and his attitude was just wrong. And Markham, his graph was all over the place. And the heart rate, respiration, and perspiration. He failed the polygraph test. Now, at this point, my number one suspect for the murder of the Wanstrath family is Markham Duff Smith.
But polygraphs are not admissible in court, and Markham Duff Smith has an alibi backed up by his wife. And then this case took another crazy turn when the medical examiner released his findings. Dr. Joseph Yehemchek is the most respected medical examiner in the whole state, and this is his case. The autopsy results came in 7 months later because for the first time ever, Dr. Yehemchek wanted to do this psychological autopsy with this new expert that he brought in from the outside.
Dr. Thomas Waylew, he's also a Catholic priest. He's a psychologist there to work on psychological autopsies. And at that point, this was the first psychological autopsy that had been done in Harris County. It was a political thing. New York and L.A. both had staff psychologists that did psychological autopsies, and Yehemchek wanted to have the same capability that New York and L.A. had.
I never heard of this. It was a new thing going around in, I guess, medical examiner circles back then. I'm not familiar with it. I never heard of it.
Diana had recently been treated for depression. Dr. Waylew believed suicide could possibly run in the family. Diana's mother, Gertrude Zabolio, died from suicide 4 years earlier. So it was understandable if Diana did too.
And they wanted to know all about the conversation I had with Diana the day she died to see what was going through her mind. And I told them Diana would never hurt Kevin or John. She couldn't have been planning this party and so happy and tending to Kevin. And she just wasn't capable of it.
But as Thomas Waylew is doing the psychological autopsy on Diana, he finds a Playboy magazine in the house, and he finds a vibrator. He told me that Diana was probably a lesbian and that she killed everybody because she was afraid this was going to come out. And I told him, I said, you're just making this crap up and saying this might be suicide. And I'm like, well, there's no gun. And Waylew says, well, now you don't rule that out. Somebody could have taken the gun. Maybe you hadn't found it yet. Maybe it's hidden somewhere. And I'm like, how did you kill yourself and then hide the gun? It's like you're creating something that doesn't exist to fit your scenario, and it's ridiculous. When you get a case that's real suicide by the medical examiner's office, we're done. That's a solved case.
Front page, murder, suicide. The medical examiner had made his ruling, and it was just like the day I had the call that they'd been murdered. I wanted Diana's name cleared of this horrible thing.
When the newspaper came out, I was working on the city desk, and I get a call that morning. The anonymous caller said that they didn't know about the Wanstrath murders, but Diana's mother's death 4 years earlier was not a suicide.
Diana Wanstrath inherited like $100,000 from her mother's death. So did Markham.
We agreed we would make a deal with Walt Walthauser about everything.
It's sort of like making a deal with the devil.
Even though the deaths of the Wanstrath family were ruled a murder-suicide, Johnny Bonds continued to work the case. In the meantime, a call comes in anonymously to the local newspaper saying that there's more going on to the death of Gertrude Zabolio.
The anonymous caller said that Diana's mother's death 4 years earlier was not a suicide. Mrs. Zabolio was murdered by a coin collector. I went to the police, and that's where I met Johnny Bonds.
Diana Wanstrath inherited like $100,000 from her mother, Trudy Zabolio's death. So did her brother Markham. After further investigation, found out that John and Diana had done a will about 6 months before they were killed. In the case of simultaneous death, they left everything to their adopted son, Kevin, and named Markham and Cindy Duff Smith as the guardians of the child. And if Kevin had been killed, Markham was going to inherit a lot of money from this.
So now Johnny Bonds hears this tip and starts to wonder if Diana's brother, Markham Duff Smith, wiped out his whole family.
Detectives that worked on the case entitled to their opinion with any case. I've never known one yet that there wasn't unanswered questions. Adams?
I was getting pressure from the homicide captain, more or less saying, back off. I was told, we got to work with Dr. Joe, don't make him mad. He was a powerful man. He made more than the governor or the football coach at University of Texas. But I felt like I owed it to Diana to prove that she was not a killer.
If you know Johnny Bonds like I do, you know that he doesn't back off from anything. So Johnny takes this information and starts looking even harder into Diana's brother, Markham Duff Smith.
At this point, Duff Smith is the suspect. So I was going around talking to everybody I could find out that knew him. And that's how I found out about Walt Walthauser. They were the closest of friends. The guy was a licensed gun dealer. He had a pilot's license. And he was a real estate investor and a coin collector.
Could Walt Walthauser have been the coin collector that the anonymous tipster talked about when they called in to say that Gertrude Zabolio's case wasn't a suicide? Johnny sure thought looking down that road might help him figure out what happened to who murdered John and Kevin and Diana.
It wasn't much later that I was transferred from homicide to internal affairs. Against my wishes. I think I was transferred to get me out of homicide.
It's really crazy and really sad how often egos can affect a case. Dr. Joe was a very powerful man in Harris County, and he did not like being questioned, and Johnny Bonds was doing that very loudly.
If I wasn't in homicide, I shouldn't have been working on that case at all. Luckily, I had some supervisors that knew me. They didn't mind if I did keep working on it.
During that period of time we worked together, in internal affairs, I knew that he was continuing to investigate the Wanstrath murders. I was asked by Johnny to help him on the case. I think all of us, to some extent, were obsessed because of the depravity of it. The idea that you would go in and kill a little baby sleeping in its crib and kill his parents, that's a pretty strong motivating factor for you to keep working on something.
That's the picture that haunted me. That's the one that looked so much like my son.
I had pictures of Kevin, and I had a picture of my son. They looked like twins, and I put them on the wall, side by side, in my office. Just a reminder every day of why I was working on that case. Kept up with Walt Walthauser and Markham Duff Smith. I knew where everybody lived. I knew what they were doing. I was actually going by their houses and watching them. There were days I'd find reasons not to go home. My wife wanted me to quit. We were fighting a lot. I had my wife tell me, is this dead family more important than the family you have here? And that's a hard question to answer, because I felt like, I'm doing something important and you ought to understand that. We ended up splitting up. That was it.
In the summer of 1980, 1 year after the Wahnstroth murders, it's discovered that Markham Duff Smith had left his wife and moved into this mansion along with Walt Waldhauser, who had also left his wife.
So I wanted to meet with Waldhauser's wife, Debbie Waldhauser. At this point, Walter and Debbie were getting a divorce. So I basically just approached her. I said, look, I've been working on this case, and Debbie says, I'll tell you everything I know on one condition. You got to help me get my child back. We're having a child custody hearing in civil court Friday afternoon. And I decided to show up. I'm outside the courtroom. Here comes Waldhauser with Duff Smith, his attorney. And Waldhauser sees me over, and he walks up to Johnny, like we're old friends. What are you doing here? I said, I'm going to say you're a suspect in killing the Wahnstroths and Trudy Zabolio. He says, you can't say that. And I said, that's what I'm going to say. The attorney gets the little boy's hand, walks over and hands him off to Debbie Waldhauser. They get in the elevator and leave. So she got her kid back, and I said, it's your turn. She told me about him taking all the stuff out of the house. It was a pile of garbage. I said, well, let's go out there. I want to look at and see what he left. I started digging around in it, and I found 2 or 3 letters from a guy named Alan Ginecca to Walt Waldhauser.
Alan Ginecca is a rougher character, has been to the pen before.
The letters were very vague, but they're talking about when I get out, we're going to do this deal. And they were talking about doing crimes, but not specific.
So Johnny had started to believe that Markham Duff Smith and Walt Waldhauser had hired Alan Ginecca to kill Gertrude Zabolio, and then ultimately to kill the Wahnstroth family.
I was working in internal affairs, and I went and talked to the captain. I said, this is fixing to come together. It's still going to be a problem because of the medical examiner, and he's not going to like this. So the captain of internal affairs ended up going to the chief of police, and they basically said, you work on this case, and don't you worry about anybody else. You're covered.
We were looking through police records and saw where a detective in homicide pulled Alan Ginecca's rap sheet in the investigation of the death of a drug dealer.
Johnny and Dan find out that in 1979, Alan Ginecca and this guy named Richard Bufkin killed a small-time drug dealer over a marijuana deal that went bad. And Richard Bufkin went to jail for it. Ginecca got away.
Sometimes situations come along that investigators want to take advantage of. In this case, Bufkin had been sentenced on a crime that Ginecca skated on. So Johnny's hope was that Bufkin would be mad enough with Ginecca that he'll give him some new information on him.
Richard Bufkin, he has paroled out. We traced him down through his family. He calls us, and Bonds is able to interview him.
Hello? I don't really have the privacy to talk right now.
All right, can you get on another line?
Hold on just a second, please.
Okay.
Can I call you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay.
You call me collect.
Richard Bufkin said, Ginecca abandoned me. He took off and left the country, and I got left holding the bag. Said, I got arrested, and he never even got picked up. Then I got through asking him about that, and I said, let me ask you something else. I said, did he ever say anything about wanting to kill a family?
You mean that actually did happen? That actually did happen.
Johnny believed with all of his heart this was not a murder-suicide, and he wasn't going to let anybody get away with it. So Johnny tracked down Richard Bufkin, just doing a long shot, hoping he was mad at Ginecca and would say something.
Bufkin confesses that he'd been approached to do the murders of the Wahnstroth family. He says, Ginecca, he asked me if I'd help him kill this family, that he had a friend that wanted his sister and her husband and their baby killed.
He told me, I would waste the man and the woman, and he would waste the baby. What he described to you, Richard, did actually take place. Mister, I was in jail. I know you were in jail. You mean that actually did happen? That actually did happen. They killed a man, a woman, and a 14-month-old baby. The baby's asleep in the crib, and they shot it in the back of the head. Yeah, that's just how he told me he was going to do it, too.
When he told me that, I cried. I just sat there and bawled. Oh, that's the day everything fell in place. That's the day I found out who my killer was.
Now that Johnny Bonds and Dan McAnulty have more information on Gionecka and what he was capable of, it's time for them to track him down and start asking him some hard questions.
We get information that Alan Gionecka's in the Atlanta area, so I fly out and arrange to meet with the local police to locate him. The local police have identified his girlfriend, Karen Holder. They've been surveilling her and her sister. They work at a supper club in the area, so I go into the club with one of the local officers in plain clothes. We do see the girls talking to some guys at a table. The deputy that I'm with recognizes this man as a former law enforcement officer. So I go talk to him. He told me that Karen had told him that she has a pistol that this guy killed some people with in Houston.
There was one bullet recovered at the crime scene. It was a hollow point .22 Magnum round. When the firearms people examined the bullet, it came back 100% to one gun, which had never happened in my whole life. This was 100% Colt Frontier Scout .22 Magnum, like what you would see in an old Western. Very seldom you see a gun like that used in a murder.
The next morning, we got to Karen Holder's apartment and knocked on the door. Karen was there with her sister. I then confronted her. I said, I've talked to someone who told me that you have the gun that Alan Gionecka killed some people in Houston with. She gets up, walks to the bedroom, comes back with this pistol in her hand.
Dan McAnulty called me and said, sit down. You're not going to believe this. He had the actual murder weapon in his hand. Firearms expert was testing the gun and saying that is the gun that fired the round that killed Kevin.
Karen Holder told us where Alan Gionecka was staying in Houston. But our plan was to first have Karen call Alan Gionecka, let me record it. I brought an old cassette recorder with me. She speaks to him for almost an hour on the phone, getting him to make certain admissions, telling him she's nervous about the gun being in the house. I'm going to go throw it in the river. And he's saying, no, Karen, don't do that. I'll come there. Let me get rid of it. And don't say anything to anybody. And you need to quit talking like this over the phone. Once she finishes talking to him, I called Bonds, tell them to go in and get him arrested now.
The Sunday before Thanksgiving in 1980, we actually got SWAT out that night to arrest him. He was arrested without incident.
He subsequently made a sworn written statement at the police station later that night wherein he denied being involved. So I'm going to take him back up to the jail up on the 5th floor. So on the way up, he says, look, I want to talk to you. I'm not going to go down by myself on this. He waives his right to a lawyer, agrees to talk to me, and then proceeds to confess to killing the Wonstrath family.
We had a confession, we had the murder weapon. It happened so quick. I don't know how to describe it. It's like having a terrible pain and all of a sudden it's gone.
But he agreed to tell me in great detail how the planning occurred with Walt Waldhauser, how they secured a gun, and that was the gun that he used.
Waldhauser was paying Gionecka through a Western Union telegram. We found the original receipt he signed and filled out. Waldhauser's prints were on that receipt. We already had Gionecka in jail, and then we arrested Waldhauser.
At the time that Walt Waldhauser was arrested, we had a very strong case on Alan Gionecka. But dangling out there was Markham Duff Smith, who was the mastermind behind everything. We didn't have enough evidence on him to convict him. We agreed we would make a deal with Walt Waldhauser to get him to testify against Markham Duff Smith about everything. Nobody liked it because Walt Waldhauser was as bad as any person I have ever come across, ever. As far as his moral capability, right and wrong, nothing fazed him. But we didn't have any other choice to go after Duff Smith.
It was sort of like making a deal with the devil. That's how we felt.
Waldhauser agrees if we reduce the capital murders to murders, he gets 30 years and immunity on anything else he tells us. He'll testify that Markham Dustsmith hired him and Janeka to kill the Wanstroths.
Walt Waldhauser and Alan Janeka are only involved in this crime because they did it for Markham Duff Smith. That's who hired him. That's who the mastermind is. That's who's the most culpable of all these defendants. Sometimes, based on the state of your evidence, and in this particular case, you have to cut a deal. Because if you don't cut a deal, then you're running the risk that the most egregious defendant walks, or maybe even everybody walks. Having to tell a family that you're cutting a deal is awful. You're telling them that one of the people involved in murdering their loved ones is going to get a sweet deal in order to get justice for anybody. It's a hard pill to have to swallow.
Waldhauser tells us Dustsmith had approached Diana and John. He wanted to build a new house in their neighborhood, and they were going to loan him money to get the house built. And Dustsmith says, well, I've got a contractor that wants to meet with y'all. And that contractor was Janeka. Janeka tells Waldhauser, I can't do this by myself. So Waldhauser goes with him to the house. They're sitting on a couch facing John and Diana. Janeka gets up, pulls the gun out. John's sitting in a chair. He comes up behind him, shoots him in the top of the head twice.
From there, my co-defendant sprayed Mrs. Wanstroth in the face with the mace and grabbed the holder and threw her down, which then at that time I walked over and put the gun to the side of her head and shot her. And at that time he told me, get the kid who's in the bedroom. As I walked in, opened the door and walked in, it was dark. I could only see from the hall light of the baby laying in the crib. At this time, my mind was completely blank. That I was just there to do a job. And looking at the little fella in the crib, I raised the weapon and pulled the trigger.
Waldhauser instructed Alan all of them had to die because it was an inheritance that was being sought, and they couldn't leave an heir.
The next day, they bring Waldhauser from the jail to a courtroom. He and his attorney shows up. I've got a typewriter, and I start typing his confession. Right off the bat, Waldhauser looked at me and says he has information on another murder. We start talking to Walt Waldhauser, and he tells us about murder of Trudy Zabolio by Alan Janeka and a guy named Paul McDonald. Paul McDonald was a friend of Waldhauser's. Paul told us about the phone call that he gets in '75 that Waldhauser has a friend that wants his mother killed. And do you know anybody to do it? So he just looks, hey, Alan, the guy wants somebody killed. Do you know somebody to do it? He said, yeah, I'll do it.
Paul McDonald drives the car. They go over to the Bolio house. Alan Janeka goes in, and he's in there an hour or so. He had her write some notes like she was committing suicide, and he placed him around there in her room, and then he strangled her to death. Homicide detectives show up. Medical examiner rules, well, she committed suicide. She choked herself to death.
Back then, forensics was not nearly as good and evolved as what we have today.
Alan Janeka, he tells me that Markham says, I want proof that they killed his mother. So Janeka had got Trudy Zabolio's driver's license out of her purse. They meet Dustsmith at a coffee shop, and Paul McDonald hands Markham Dustsmith his mother's driver's license.
Even though Walt Waldhauser found the hitman, because of his deal to give information against Markham Dustsmith, he is not charged with the murder of Gertrude Zabolio. Paul McDonald got 16 years.
Janeka denies strangling Gertrude Zabolio, and even though Johnny and Dan felt like Alan Janeka was instrumental in Gertrude Zabolio's murder, they just could never prove it. In December of 1980, Alan Gionecka was charged with the murder of Kevin Wonstroth because not only did they have evidence from Gionecka admitting he committed that murder, they also had the bullet recovered that matched Gionecka's gun. Well, they could have charged him with any of the 3 murders, but they chose the one of the baby because look how emotional that would be to a jury.
After Walter Waldhauser confessed he was involved in the death of Gertrude Zabolio and the Wonstrath killings and implicated Markham Duff Smith, the big day had finally arrived, and Johnny and Dan went out to Markham Duff Smith's house.
His girlfriend answered the door. Markham was just getting out of the shower.
He looks at me at the mirror. He doesn't flinch. He just looks up and he's shaving. I said, Markham, I got a warrant for your arrest. Handcuffed him, took him out. Dan had his personal camera with him, and we're walking out to the car, and Dan says, wait, and he walks in front of us. And I'm standing there holding him like this, and Dan takes a picture. Both sitting there real solemn looking, and I'm kind of biting my tongue, trying not to smile, and I didn't. We actually ended up arresting Duff Smith for Trudy Zabolio's murder. He wasn't charged for the Wonstroth case. He was tried for killing his mother.
Well, they could have charged him with any of the murders, but you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You want to pick your best case and try that one, because what happens if the defendant's found not guilty, if there's a hung jury, if the punishment is way less than what you expect, if any of those bad outcomes happen, you still have other cases you can file on a defendant and try him for.
I remember Johnny called, and he said that Markham was arrested. Oh, it was poetic justice. It was relief of a sort. I just remember being so ecstatic that we were getting where we were getting.
Finally, once all the confessions are in hand, the murder weapons obtained, reluctantly, the medical examiner's office changed the ruling of the Wonstrath's death to triple homicide.
Yesterday, Gionecka's former girlfriend, Karen Holder, told the court he gave her the pistol, saying he'd used it to kill 3 people. But so far, Judge Jimmy James has not allowed her testimony to be heard by the jury.
The defense in this case claimed Karen was common law married to Alan Gionecka. We were pretty surprised about that. The judge said, they're married. You can't use anything she said at the time of the offense or since the time of the offense about Alan Gionecka. All of her testimony and statements are inadmissible.
In some of the southern states, because it's about the sanctity of marriage, the marriage is more important than getting away with murder, believe it or not. And what it means is that you can't testify against your spouse on any communications you have during the time you're married. Very much a problem and a complication.
So now we have the gun, but the difficulty was to prove that Alan Gionecka had it and gave it to Karen.
Judge Jimmy James ruled that Alan Gionecka's girlfriend couldn't testify about the gun due to the marital communications privilege. The prosecution needed to figure out a workaround to make that gun evidence admissible.
And that was proved through Karen's sister, who was there in the apartment, who lived in the apartment, and other witnesses could tie Alan Gionecka to bringing the gun to the apartment. The jury finds Alan Gionecka guilty of capital murder, of murdering Kevin Wonstroth for money, which made it a capital offense. He got the death penalty. And then we started the trial with Markham Duff Smith for killing his mother. We did everything we could to keep Walt Waldhauser from ever being around Markham Duff Smith in the county jail. So they never had contact with each other. And then one time, the sheriff's department made a mistake. Walt Waldhauser and Markham Duff Smith were in the same holding cell together alone. They were working a deal, how they both could go free.
As it turns out, once a con man, always a con man.
Walter Waldhauser starts talking to another inmate to sabotage his confession against his pal, Markham Duff Smith.
Walter would start telling people in the county jail, oh, I'm making this all up. I'm doing this to frame Markham Duff Smith, because he had already gotten his 30 years on 3 cases. And we looked at the agreement. Never in there did it say, if you change your testimony, the deal is off. We had to go through with the deal because we didn't draw it up good enough to keep that possibility from happening.
The prosecution decided that because Walt Walthauser was making stuff up in the back, he's a liar. So how credible can he be to a jury? So they ended up not even calling him.
Oh, I was pissed. I was so mad.
We went to trial thinking we may not even convict Markham Duff Smith because the evidence was so flimsy. But then there was a once-in-a-lifetime courtroom moment. We get a call from the warden. You got a guy up here that wants to talk to you. Jerry Saul Eichenhorst. He was serving time in the Texas penitentiary. He was serving 2 life sentences, one for armed robbery, one for rape, and I prosecuted him on the rape case.
He says, Duff Smith approached me and said if I'd lie, that he'd help pay for my appeal, and that when I got out of jail, he'd give me some money if I'd lie for him. Then he gave me this to testify. He pulls out this script, 2 full pages of a script for him to testify to. So we brought it back. We got Duff Smith's fingerprints on this, and Eichenhorst too. We had a handwriting expert look at it, and I had the notebook that we could say was his writing. Said, yeah, that's the same guy wrote this, you know. There was a discovery period. If we'd have had this information 2 weeks before the trial, we would have had to give it to the defense. Then we would have called him, but it would have been better if they called him, and that's exactly what they did.
So during the defense, they start calling these inmates in the county jail who got on the witness stand and said, Walt Walthauser told me that he was framing Duff Smith and that he was not telling the truth and he did it all, etc. They all were saying the same thing. Then they call Eichenhorst. He takes the witness stand. The defense says Walt Walthauser did the killings and framed Duff Smith. And is that true? That is not a true statement. Well, how do we know you're telling the truth now? Well, I've got evidence. Out comes this piece of paper where Markham Duff Smith had written out what you're supposed to say. Talk about a moment in time. There was a gasp in the courtroom. The jury, the spectators, the lawyers, and Markham Duff Smith. And he turned completely white, then red, and it was shuddering, physically shuddering.
I looked over at Markham Duff Smith and I said, Markham, you just signed your death warrant.
The lawyers say to Eichenhorst, well, why would you do that? The prosecutors promise you something? Why would you do that? Aren't you a snitch? Eichenhorst says, yes, I'm a snitch. The worst thing in the penitentiary in Texas is to be a snitch, except to be a baby killer.
After deliberating for only 40 minutes, the jury in Gertrude Zabulio's murder, where the defendant was Markham Duff Smith, came back with a verdict.
The jury comes back and says guilty. I had feelings of jubilation.
The jury then goes and deliberates after the verdict of guilty on the issue of punishment. And they have to answer 2 questions, whether the conduct was deliberate and whether or not he would commit criminal acts of violence in the future.
They gave him death in, I think it was a record, like 12 minutes. It was the quickest death sentence I ever experienced.
Both of us felt this sense of relief. For a year and a half, we lived and breathed this case and spent a lot of time away from our families. It's a great feeling to find out the truth and have the right result to occur.
So you definitely feel that justice was done today?
Yes, it was done. When the verdict was rendered against Markham, I was actually happy. When I say that I was happy, it's not the happy of joy. I guess it's really more of a relief. This was just, this had to be done.
I was not surprised at all. The minute that script was read to the jury, it was over.
The day of Markham's execution, as he's on the gurney and they're putting the lethal injection in his arm, he confesses, asked for forgiveness, he was a sinner, and yes, he'd killed his family and was eternally sorry for it.
I guess it was a surprise that he actually confessed, but maybe his conscience had gotten to him. All along, all I wanted was for Diana, John, and Kevin, and Trudy now, to have their justice and to give us some peace and closure.
I witnessed Alan Gionecka's execution in 2003. I didn't feel sorry for him, and I didn't feel any great relief. His execution was gentle compared to all the damage he'd done. Later, when it's all over with, I got all kinds of awards and accolades, and then got a book written about the case, and I got this Meritorious Service Award, which is like the highest award the police department gets. Captain Adams, the one that told me to shut up, he nominated me for that award. And he asked me to come back to homicide. In the long run, it ended up being great for my career because I stuck with it. It ended up being the best thing ever happened in my life. Waldhauser comes up every year for parole, and I show up protesting his parole. If anybody ever ought to die in prison, it's him. I've wept a lot over this case. That picture of Kevin Wanstroth, I'll never forget it. There was pressure to let up, to quit, but I couldn't live with myself to let that happen.
When you see Johnny and Dan and Ted Poe talk about this case and what it did to them, I bet you they would tell you that this case was the defining case of each of their careers. I think that these murders is just a reminder to all of us who do this job what the cases do to you. They take away a little bit of your soul. They take away a little bit of your humanity. Might make you stronger, might make you better in the courtroom, but it also makes you a different human being.